He buried the supplies years before he needed them. He drove thousands of miles to commit crimes far from home. He paid cash for everything, kept no digital trail, and changed his method every single time. Israel Keyes was not impulsive. He was an architect, and the only reason anyone knows his name today is because he couldn't resist using a dead girl's debit card. That is how close he came to never being caught at all. Israel Keyes was born in January 1978 in Richmond, Utah. He grew up in a strict religious household. One of 10 children, raised largely off the grid in Washington state. The family was deeply influenced by Christian identity, a white supremacist theological movement that shaped the ideological landscape of his early years. Whatever normal childhood development was supposed to look like, Keyes did not have it. He did not present as obviously disturbed. That was part of what made him so dangerous. He held jobs. He served in the United States Army from 1998 to 2001. He had a daughter. He ran a construction business in Anchorage, Alaska. On the surface, he was unremarkable in all the ways that mattered. But beneath that surface, something had been building for a very long time. Investigators would later conclude that Keyes began killing as a teenager. He himself referenced crimes going back to at least the late 1990s. He was meticulous about one thing above all else, keeping his criminal life entirely sealed off from his personal life. No overlaps, no patterns for police to follow, no convenience. He studied law enforcement methodology. He understood how killers got caught, proximity to victims, digital footprints, consistent signatures, geographic clustering, and he engineered his crimes to avoid every one of those mistakes. Keyes did not hunt in his own backyard. He traveled, sometimes across the country, sometimes internationally. He flew to one location, rented a car under his real name, drove hundreds of miles to where he needed to be, and then drove back. He understood that the car rental record would put him in a city, but never at a scene. The burial caches were his most distinctive innovation. At some point before he needed to kill, Israel Keyes would drive or fly to a remote location, forests, fields, places rarely visited, and bury a kit. Inside those kits, firearms, ammunition, plastic sheeting, ligatures, cash, murder supplies, cached like a survivalist preparing for a war that only he knew was coming. He would then leave. Sometimes months passed, sometimes years. When he was ready to act, he would travel back to retrieve what he had left, or use a cache near a target he had already identified. This is not the behavior of someone acting on impulse. This is planning on a scale that few investigators had ever encountered. The cache system also served a secondary purpose. If he was ever stopped during a crime, he would not be carrying weapons that could be traced. He was clean on the road, clean at the airport. The evidence existed only in holes in the ground, in places no one would ever think to look. This was how he solved the problem of funding. Keyes robbed banks, not as a separate criminal hobby, as a logistics strategy. Authorities corroborated that he robbed banks in Tupper Lake, New York, and Azle, Texas, in April 2009 and February 2012. The proceeds went into the caches alongside the weapons. The cash in those kits came directly from bank robberies he committed to support his criminal activities. The confirmed victim count is small, with Keyes himself suggesting the true number was at least 11, possibly more. Bill and Lorraine Currier were a married couple in their 50s. They lived quietly in Essex, Vermont. By all accounts, ordinary people, homebodies, described by those who knew them as friendly and peaceful. On the night of June 8th and into the morning of June 9th, 2011, they became the random victims of a planned attack. Keyes had left Alaska on June 2nd, flown to Chicago, rented a car, and driven to Vermont. He had been to the same area before, in 2009, conducting what investigators believe was reconnaissance. He selected the Currier home, in part because of its ranch floor plan and because there were no signs that children lived there. He broke in during the night, armed with a gun and silencer. He tied them up, forced them into their own car, and drove them to an abandoned house nearby. Both of them fought. Keyes brought Bill into the basement and tied him to a stool. When he came back upstairs, Lorraine had partially freed herself from the car. It did not save either of them. He shot Bill Currier with a gun he had taken from their home, then sexually assaulted and strangled Lorraine. Their bodies have never been found. They were reported missing the next morning, when neither showed up for work. For over a year, investigators had no idea what had happened to them. No suspect, no motive, no trail. As U.S. Attorney Tristram Coffin put it, they were friendly, peaceful people who encountered a force of pure evil acting at random. That randomness was not a flaw in his system. It was the point. The case that defined his public profile was the murder of Samantha Koenig. Samantha was 18 years old. She worked at a coffee stand called Common Grounds in Anchorage, Alaska. On the night of February 1st, 2012, Keyes walked up to the stand, produced a weapon, bound Samantha, and abducted her. He had scoped the location beforehand. He knew she would be alone. He knew the layout. What followed was calculated to a degree that still disturbs investigators who worked the case. After killing Samantha Koenig, Keyes left Alaska on a pre-planned cruise vacation with his girlfriend and daughter. He had booked the trip before the abduction. He spent weeks traveling, living normally, while Samantha's body was concealed in his shed back in Anchorage. When he returned, he staged a ransom note. He photographed Samantha with a newspaper dated after her death to create the illusion that she was alive and being held. He then dismembered her body and disposed of it beneath the ice of a frozen lake. He used her debit card to withdraw ransom money, and here is where the architecture began to crack. Before Samantha's case, Keyes had spent years operating with extraordinary discipline, but in early 2012, something shifted. He began making withdrawals from Samantha's account at ATMs across the southern United States, Texas, New Mexico, Georgia. He was moving, pulling small amounts, using locations far from Alaska. It was a deliberate attempt to mislead investigators, to imply Samantha was still alive and traveling. What he underestimated was the reach of surveillance infrastructure. The ATM withdrawals created a trail of transaction data and camera footage. Law enforcement began tracking the card. On March 13th, 2012, Keyes was pulled over in Lufkin, Texas, not for murder, not for kidnapping, but as part of a traffic stop connected to the ATM investigation. He had Samantha's debit card on him. He was arrested on the spot for robbery and use of another person's financial instruments. He had survived years of methodical killing across multiple states. He had buried weapons in forests. He had flown across the country to avoid leaving geographic patterns. He had staged crime scenes with theatrical precision, and he was finally stopped because of a debit card. The gap between what he was and what caught him is almost absurd. When federal investigators from the FBI got Keyes into interrogation, they found something unexpected. He was cooperative, almost eager. He did not break the way most suspects break, under pressure, in desperation, trying to bargain. Keyes engaged with investigators on what felt, at times, like intellectual terms. He spoke about his crimes with clinical precision. He described his methods. He talked about the cash system, about how he had selected victims, about the geographic spread of his activity. He seemed to understand that the game was over, and he had decided to play the ending on his own terms. But he had conditions. He would not name all of his victims. He provided information incrementally, sometimes in fragments that investigators struggled to piece together. He spoke about 11 victims, then suggested there might be more. He referenced crimes in states he declined to specify. He alluded to murders investigators have never been able to confirm. The FBI recordings from these sessions are some of the most unsettling documents in modern criminal investigation, not because Keyes expressed remorse or fear, but because he expressed neither. He was composed, thoughtful. He talked about murder the way a craftsman talks about a technique. He took pride in having built something investigators could barely comprehend. There are moments in those recordings where the agents in the room seem almost destabilized by the conversation they are having. At one point, Keyes expressed frustration, not with his situation, but with the idea that he might be remembered as just another serial killer. He wanted investigators to understand that what he had done was different, more controlled, more sophisticated. He was, in his own assessment, in a category by himself. That particular form of vanity may be the most honest thing he ever said. While the Koenig case was the one that caught him, investigators were simultaneously working to understand the full scope of what Keyes had done. Israel Keyes was charged with the murder of Samantha Koenig. He was facing the death penalty. On December 2nd, 2012, Keyes was found dead in his cell at the Anchorage Correctional Complex. He had cut his wrists and strangled himself using material from his bed. He left a note, written in what appeared to be his own blood. He was 34 years old. The note has never been fully released to the public. With his death went whatever full accounting of his crimes might have existed. The FBI has publicly stated that they believe he killed at least 11 people and that the true number may never be known. There are caches that may never have been found. There are victims whose names are still unknown. There are families who have never received answers because Israel Keyes decided he would be the only one who knew everything. That was the final act of control. He built a system designed to outlast any investigation. He killed without patterns. He planned across years. He buried his tools in the ground like seeds. And when the walls finally closed in, not because of investigative brilliance, but because of a debit card in a dead girl's name, he spent his last months deciding exactly how much of himself he would leave behind. He left just enough to make sure you would never stop wondering about the rest.